Ever since I was a kid, I've been a fan of collecting Transformer figures of all different shapes and sizes. But these days, I mainly only focus on collecting third-party Legend Scale Transformer figures. Because that's the main type of figures I collect these days, I've collected quite a few of these different types of figures. So today I wanted to sit down and rank all 50 of my Legend Scale Transformer figures and figure out which are the best and which are the worst. What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Speakerhead, and today we're going to be doing a tier list ranking every single one of my Legend Scale Transformers I have in my collection. But before we get into this video, if you enjoy any of this sort of content and want to see more of it, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. We have a goal to hit 1,500 subscribers by 2024, so if you want to help me reach that goal, make sure to subscribe. Also, if you enjoy any of the music in this video or just want to support the channel in general, it's all part of my royalty-free music label, Speakerhead Studios. All the music on this label is completely royalty-free, so go ahead and use it for any of your content creating needs. Finally, want to mention, if you want to support the channel through 3 different tiers, you can become a channel member today and get access to some exclusive perks. But now that we got all that out of the way, let's actually start talking about this tier list. So before we actually get into this tier list, let me give a brief explanation of how I'm going to be doing this. So for this tier list, I'll be ranking every single Legend Scale Transformer that I currently have. And on this list, I'll be including full combiners and their individual components as well, because they are all individual Transformers and you can enjoy them on their own. But we'll be going through every single one of these Legend Scale figures and we'll be deciding which tier they should all go on. So I'll also mention that I won't be giving a huge explanation for every single one of these figures, because if I gave a long explanation of why I'm putting each one in each tier, it's going to be a very long video. But for each figure, I will give a very brief explanation of why I'm putting in what tier I choose. Hey everybody, Speakerhead from the future here. So I noticed while editing, I said a certain word a lot, and that certain word happened to be overall. I was originally going to try to cut these out of the video, but honestly there was just way too many, so I decided to make fun of myself instead and added a counter at the top of the screen. So right now I want you guys to leave a comment guessing how many times I say overall during this tier list. But anyways, back to the present me. So without further ado, let's actually jump into this tier list. And to start off, we have New Age Reflector. So I'm a pretty big fan of this figure, and it does come with 3 of these guys, and there's a reason why these guys are the only one that are clumped together. And that's essentially because they are just the same figure done 3 times. But for these guys, they're pretty good overall figures with good articulation. I'd say the only bad thing I really don't like about them is the ball joints for their elbows. But overall, I think they're pretty solid, so I think I'm going to put these guys at a B tier for now. Now we have New Age Cliff Jumper, and I kinda like this figure, but he isn't the greatest Legend Scale Transformer. I like the overall sculpt of this Cliff Jumper, but he has pretty bad knee articulation, which I'm not a fan of. And overall the feet are pretty ugly looking, so I think I'm going to be putting this guy at a C. Now moving on to a Legend Scale bot of similar size, we have New Age Shrapnel. He's a pretty alright figure. He's not anything crazy or anything to write home about, but he's definitely a solid little Legend Scale figure. And just with his overall sculpt, articulation, and everything, I think I'm going to be putting this guy at a C tier as well. He's just not the greatest figure, but he's alright. With our next figure, it's technically not a third-party Legend Scale figure, but I do have him part of my Legend Scale collection. And this is going to be the Hasbro Core Class Hot Rod. So for my Core Class Hot Rod, I actually added a little bit of paint to this guy, so he does look pretty ugly if you don't add extra paint to him. But overall, for a fairly cheap price, he is a pretty solid little Core Class figure. However, that being said, he is a pretty junky figure compared to all these other Legend Scale figures, so I'm going to be putting him at a D tier. Now moving on to the exact opposite scale of that, we have Magic Square Perceptor. So for those who have seen my top 5 Magic Square figures video, you guys know that I rated this guy at number 1. He just has overall fantastic sculpt, great posability, a more sturdier plastic compared to what Magic Square normally uses. And I forget the name of the one that I got, but I got the more painted version, so he just looks so much better. And because of this, I'm actually going to be putting this guy at our first S tier. I just actually absolutely love this guy. I might be a little biased because I love Perceptor, but I really love this Magic Square figure. It's a really great figure. Moving on to another Magic Square figure, we have Magic Square Wild Rider. Now this guy plus all the other Stunticons I got were going to be part of Magic Square's 5-pack they released with a premium paint job. I did want to mention that because these guys are going to be a little bit different compared to the original releases of these figures. But when it comes to this guy, I think he's a pretty solid figure with overall good sculpt and decent articulation. But he's definitely not the greatest figure, so right now I'm kind of bouncing between C or B. And honestly, I think I'm going to be putting this guy at B because I really do like the transformation of him. It's nice and easy, and I just like doing it over and over again. It's a super simple transformation. So moving on from Magic Square Wild Rider, we're going to be talking about our one and only Iron Factory figure, and that's going to be Iron Factory Hound. So I've recently just done a review on this figure if you want to check that review out, but this guy is really a solid figure overall. Iron Factory's always had great quality figures and their articulation is pretty solid as well, and this guy is no exception to that. When it comes to articulation, he's probably one of my top 10 favorite articulated figures, and he does have a really cool looking sculpt. He might be a bit stylized compared to the rest of my Legend Scale Transformers, but I really do like this figure, so I think I'm going to be putting him at an A tier. So I'm going from ground vehicles to air vehicles. Now we're going to be talking about New Age Skywarp. So this is going to be the first of a few Seeker molds we have on the list, but I really do love this specific sculpt. I'm a fan of the colors they use for Skywarp because he uses silver compared to Starscream and Thundercracker, so I think that looks really awesome. And I'll be 100% honest, Skywarp's always been my personal favorite Seeker just because I always thought his color scheme was the coolest. But to try to keep this as unbiased as possible, right now I'm going to be putting this guy at a B tier because I really do like the overall sculpt of the mold. I just think that New Age did an awesome job with their Seeker mold, so I think this mold at least deserves a B tier. So now moving on from a Decepticon, we're moving on to not just an Autobot, but the leader of the Autobots, New Age Optimus Prime. And this guy is really an overall fantastic figure. I really like the overall sculpt of this Optimus Prime, it just looks fantastic. Plus the paint job they used on this figure just looks amazing, I absolutely love it. And then he has fantastic articulation as well. So for this guy, I really think that he is a fantastic figure. Right now I'm really debating between S tier and A tier. And after thinking about it, I think I'm going to be putting him at an A tier for now, but that might end up moving somewhere else in the future. And we're going to be making adjustments towards the end of the list once we've actually placed everything. But right now, New Age Optimus Prime is going to be put at an A tier. Now moving on to our next Legend Scale figure, we're going to have New Age Bone Crusher. And even though this guy is just part of a combiner, this guy is a solid figure on his own. He has an overall great sculpt, plus he has articulated hands, which is pretty awesome. And he also has really good leg articulation, so he's able to get into a kneeling position, so he has fantastic articulation as well. So overall, I think I'm going to be putting this guy actually at an A tier because he's a great figure on his own. But moving on to another Decepticon, now we're going to be moving on to Thundercracker, the second Seeker we have on this list. And just like his brother Skywarp, this guy has a fantastic sculpt. I'll be honest, I think Thundercracker's paint job is the weakest out of all three of the Seekers that I own. And because he is a Seeker, we'll be putting him next to his brother in B tier. Moving on to another Constructicon, now we're going to have New Age Hook. And unlike Bone Crusher, this guy is honestly not as good in my opinion. He has the same great leg articulation that Bone Crusher has, but my main problem with him is that his chest does not lock in place, so it likes to spin a lot, which really bugs me. And overall, I just don't think his sculpt is as good as Bone Crusher's. And to be completely honest, I think he's one of the weakest New Age Constructicons out of all of them. So for New Age Hook, I think we're going to be putting this guy in C tier for now. But now moving back to Magic Square, now we have Magic Square Ironhide. And I really like this figure overall. I think it's one of the best, if not the best, Ironhide mold we have out there for any scale Transformer figure. On top of that, he has amazing articulation, some of the best articulation I've seen on any figure. Plus he has a bunch of different hands you can swap out, which really helps with posing the figure and getting different looks for him. So when it comes to Magic Square Ironhide, I think we're going to be putting it up there with Magic Square Perceptor in S tier because this guy is just a fantastic figure. So now moving on to our first Zeta figure, we're going to have the Zeta Mini Firefly. So I'll be honest, I was super excited to get a mini aerial bot team for my Legend Scale collection, but these guys are pretty junky. Specifically for this figure, he doesn't have the greatest articulation to him. It's pretty standard, if not subpar, for a Legend Scale figure. And also some things just don't like to lock in very well, such as the parts where you pull the arms and legs down and they're supposed to lock in place. That sometimes doesn't work very well. And overall, it just isn't that great of a figure. It kind of feels cheap even though it has metal in it. It just feels weird. I just am not a fan of this figure. But for this guy, we're just going to be putting him at a C tier. So now bouncing back to the Decepticon side, we're going to have New Age Shockwave. And overall, I really do think this is an awesome Shockwave. So this guy used to be rated my #1 New Age figure, and sadly he's moved down the list from #1, but he overall still is a fantastic legend scale figure. He has a fantastic sculpt, and he does have a super clever transformation that I really like. So for New Age Shockwave, I think we're going to be putting this guy in an A tier for now. So now moving on to the Zeta Mini Slingshot. This guy is an alright figure, but he's not that great. Just like I was talking about with Air Raid earlier, these guys aren't the greatest legend scale figures overall. He has fairly limited articulation, just like his teammate I talked about, and overall he just has a lot of loose joints that I'm just not a huge fan of. So for this guy, I'm actually going to be putting him in a D tier. But now talking about another bot from a different combiner team, now we're going to have New Age Long Haul. And for a long haul figure, I think he's pretty solid. I'm not a fan of the ball joint for the elbows, but overall the sculpt isn't terrible. And I think he's a pretty fun figure to mess around with, so I think I'm going to be putting him at a C tier. So now moving on to my favorite character made in legend scale, and this is going to be New Age Soundwave. Now when I talk about this figure, it might sound a little bit biased, but I think this is a pretty solid legend scale figure. I think it's a fantastic sculpt for Soundwave. I think he just looks good with this slimmer look. And I'll admit the blues on him are a little bit darker than what I'd personally like, but overall he's still a fantastic figure. Plus he has a double elbow joint, so that way he's able to actually push his little eject button, which is awesome. So for New Age Soundwave, this guy's going to be put up in A tier. Now moving on to a bit of a curveball figure, we're going to be having Toy World Whiskey Jack Black variant. And even though he isn't the colors of our classic Wheeljack, I think this is a really awesome figure. And considering how old it is compared to a lot of these other legend scale figures, this guy really does hold up pretty well. I'll admit he does have really stubby forearms, but other than that, I think he's a pretty awesome figure. Plus he has a super simplistic transformation, so I really just love having this guy as a despot to transform. So I'll be putting this Toy World Whiskey Jack in B tier because I really do like him. Now moving on to our second Insecticon for this list, we're going to have New Age Kickback. So this is probably my least favorite of the 3 Insecticons that come in the pack. Because for those who don't know, all the Insecticons come in a pack of 3. And it's not even because he's my least favorite Insecticon, that's actually going to be Shrapnel. I'm just really not that big of a fan of this specific legend scale figure. He has very skinny legs and feet, so sometimes it makes it difficult to actually pose this figure, especially considering how small he is already. Plus, I'm not the biggest fan how you're not able to adjust his wings at all in robot mode. They're just kind of stuck in place, sticking straight upwards. That being said, I don't think he's the worst legend scale figure out there, so I'm just going to be putting him at a C tier with his Insecticon brother. But now moving on to our first combiner of the list, and that's going to be the Mini Zeta Superion. Now, even though I'm not the biggest fan of the individual combiner team, I am a big fan of the overall Big Bot. I'll admit he does have some problems here and there that I'm not a big fan of. Such as the chest plate always falling off of mine, so I actually glued mine on with a dot of super glue. Then I will admit the arms being built into the actual combiner bots does make the arms a little bit janky to work with. So considering he's our only legend scale Superion at the moment, he's a pretty good Superion. However, that being said, compared to the other legend scale combiners that we have, this guy is not that great. So the Mini Zeta Superion is going to be put at a C tier for now. But now moving on to a much smaller bot, we're going to be talking about New Age RC. So being the only fembot in my collection, I think that she's a pretty awesome figure. She's got a great sculpt with a pretty decent sized backpack, but definitely not the worst backpack I've seen on an RC figure. And overall, she has a pretty good paint job and some decent articulation, so I think we're going to be putting RC at a B tier. But now moving on to a beautifully painted bot, we're going to have New Age Cyclonus. And now when I say beautiful paint job, I definitely mean that because just the regular figure has a beautiful paint job on it. I absolutely love the pearlescent bluish purple that they use, it just looks fantastic. And I think for the overall sculpt of Cyclonus, New Age absolutely nailed it, he just looks amazing. And many people even compare the sculpt of this guy to the Fans Toys version. And he does have pretty good articulation, I'll admit not the greatest articulation, but definitely not terrible. So for New Age Cyclonus, I think I'm going to be putting this guy at an A tier, and that's just because of the paint job, it just looks amazing. But now moving on to a bot that almost has no paint applied on him, and that's going to be New Age Jetfire. So the Jetfire figure I bought is going to be the plain plastic version, but if you buy the EX version, all those whites are going to be painted. I'll admit in pictures it's pretty much not noticeable at all, but in person it's a lot more noticeable. But getting back to my New Age Jetfire, I absolutely love this figure. I've never owned a Jetfire figure before, but I don't think I'll ever have to buy one again with this figure. He has an overall fantastic sculpt, some great articulation points, and really fun transformation. And overall, I think he's just one of the best Legend Scale figures we've gotten from any Legend Scale company, so this guy's definitely got to go up there in S tier. But now moving on to a much smaller bot, we're going to be talking about New Age Mixmaster. Now for the photo I used for the tier list, it's actually going to be Mixmaster with the 2.0 upgraded legs. And as far as I'm aware, I can get the upgraded legs for free, but I actually have the original legs on this guy. And for those who have those original legs, you know that they were awful. They were the most wonky, janky legs I've ever seen on a Legend Scale, if not any Transformer figure. It just had a bunch of stuff folding in that was really weird and just looked really bad on the figure. So taking that into account, considering I only have the 1.0 legs, I'm going to be putting this guy at a D tier, but if I had the upgraded legs, he would probably be up at a C tier. But now bring it back to another Zeta figure, we're going to have the Mini Zeta Skydive. And this guy's pretty much a remold of their air raid, so overall I think this guy's also going to be going in a C tier. He's definitely not the worst figure out there, but he definitely isn't a great figure to have independently. But now moving on to our next Legend Scale figure, we're going to have New Age Power Glide. So this guy along with the New Age Omega Supreme were my most recent Legend Scale figures that I picked up. And this guy has quickly been growing to be one of my favorite Legend Scale figures that I own. This is probably because I just really love Power Glide as a character, so I'm super glad to have a little Legend Scale version of him now. But overall, he is a pretty solid figure considering he is a little mini bot. I love the red paint they used on him, it just looks fantastic. Plus the overall sculpt and posability of this guy is pretty awesome as well. So when it comes to New Age Power Glide, I think this guy's actually going to be going up in between either A or B tier, I'm not quite sure. I think compared to other figures, he definitely doesn't stack up to A tier, but he's definitely a very high B tier in my opinion. So now moving on to one of New Age's Carbots, we have New Age Mirage. I do really like this figure, but his robot mode does look a little off in my opinion. I just think he looks a little bit chunky, almost chibi-like, so it does look a little goofy. But I do like a lot of the paint they used on there, and I really like the chrome they used on him, it just looks really nice. But for New Age Mirage, I think he's going to be going in C tier. But now moving on to another New Age Carbot, we have New Age Jazz. So this guy's a pretty old Legend Scale figure, it's actually going to be the second Legend Scale figure New Age has ever produced. And he's overall a pretty decent figure, but you can definitely tell he was an older Legend Scale figure compared to the ones we're getting these days. He just doesn't have the cleanest sculpt compared to what we're getting with these G1 figures looking like they're getting pulled straight out of the screen. And having those ball joints for the elbows just really shows the older engineering they were using. So even though I think he is a pretty decent Legend Scale figure, I honestly think he does need an updated version made by New Age. So for that reason, we're actually going to be putting this guy in D tier. So now moving on to the biggest Legend Scale figure we have on this list, and that's going to be New Age Omega Supreme. So for those who have seen my review on this Omega Supreme, you know I absolutely love this figure. I still think he's the best Omega Supreme we've gotten in any scale, at least when it comes to his articulation. Because New Age really tried to make this guy as articulated as possible, and they succeeded with that with flying colors. And considering that he has better articulation than some of the smaller figures on this list, I have to give this guy an S tier. Speaking of fantastic Legend Scale figures, now we have Magic Square Nemesis Prime. So this guy's just a repaint of Magic Square's 2.0 Optimus Prime, but he doesn't have a trailer included. But that being said, I'm super happy I was able to pick up this mold no matter the color because it is a fantastic Optimus Prime mold. And I'll be honest, this Optimus Prime mold does look better than the New Age Optimus Prime mold in my personal opinion. At least in the robot mode, because I personally prefer the New Age Optimus Prime's alt mode. But that being said, this Nemesis Prime is super articulated and he has an amazing paint job to him. I just really love the silvers they use, plus the red they use for his chest just looks amazing. And I personally think this is one of the better, if not one of the best Magic Square figures ever released, so this guy is going to be going up in S tier. But now moving on to our final Seeker, and probably the most iconic Seeker, and it's going to be New Age Starscream. And just like the other Seekers, the overall mold of this figure is pretty solid. And honestly, I do love the paint job of this Starscream a lot, it just looks really good. New Age did a fantastic job. But just like the other Seekers, I'm going to be putting this guy in a B tier because he's a great figure, but definitely not the best and not any better than the other Seekers. So now moving on to our second combiner for this list, and that's going to be Magic Square Menasor. So overall, I really like Magic Square Stunticons, but I really love their Menasor. This guy just looks really awesome, and he has some pretty solid articulation points. Plus certain figures just look really natural in whatever stance they're in, and this guy is one of those figures. And considering the main body of Menasor is made up of Motormaster's trailer, this guy is overall fairly sturdy for a combiner. So when it comes to Magisaur Menasor, I'm really debating between putting him either A tier or S tier. Because essentially he's either a really high A tier or a very low S tier. That's what I'm really deciding on. And after thinking about it, I think I'm going to be putting him at an A tier because he just quite isn't at S tier. But now moving on to a teeny tiny little bot, we have New Age Bombshell. Now this has always been my favorite Insecticon, but overall he isn't that great of a figure. He's definitely not terrible considering he's probably one of the smallest legend scale figures that we have. But he's definitely not great, and I wish that he could be a teeny tiny bit better. But just like the other Insecticons, this guy is going to be going in C tier. But now moving on to another Constructicon, we're going to have New Age Scrapper. So I'll be honest, Scrapper's always been my favorite Constructicon, and he is overall a fantastic figure by New Age. He's fairly lacking on paint just like all the other Constructicons, but I really do like the overall sculpt of him. And I'll admit I have the 1.0 legs on my New Age figure, but the 2.0 legs are pretty solid. But even with the 1.0 legs on this figure, I just absolutely love this figure. So I might be a little biased here because I do love Scrapper as a character, but I really do love this figure as a whole, and he's really fun to pose around. So when it comes to New Age Scrapper, I'm going to be putting him up in A tier with Bone Crusher. But now moving on to the leader of a different combiner team, we're going to have Mini Zeta Silverbolt. So for those who might have noticed, I haven't put any sort of figures in F tier yet. And honestly, that's what I've been saving this individual figure for. Now when I originally got this figure, I was super excited because I absolutely wanted a Silverbolt to mess around with. He was always my favorite aerial bot, so I really wanted to get a figure of him. And at first I really did enjoy having this figure, but the more I messed around with him, the more problems I had. So within the first week or so of owning this figure, one of the pins fell out of the back and that really bugged me. So I had to make a makeshift one out of a toothpick, and I know I could have probably just went and bought a new pin, but that's what I did. And then later when I was taking pictures of these figures for my Legend Scale Combiner video, the other pin fell out and broke. So I don't even mess with this Silverbolt figure anymore because the backpack just doesn't attach to him anymore. On top of that, he does have a lot of other problems with him, which I could get into if I make a review on this guy, but trust me, this guy is just not a good figure in any way. So like I said, for that reason, this Mini Zeta Silverbolt will be going in F tier, our first and only F tier at the moment. But now moving on to our last aerial bot for this list, and it's going to be the Mini Zeta Fireflight. And just like all the other aerial bots, he is not a very good figure. In fact, I put him on the same level as their Slingshot because I just don't think these guys are very great figures. So like I said, he's going to be put on D tier with Slingshot. But now moving on to another mini bot, we have New Age Beachcomber. And I really like this figure, but he does have some problems with him. And one of my biggest problems is that he's a very thin character and he's pretty prone to fall over easily. Plus he doesn't have the greatest articulation, and on top of that, he doesn't have the greatest looking back legs. So for New Age Beachcomber, we're just going to be putting him at C tier. But now moving on to our last combiner for this list, and it's going to be New Age Devastator. And out of all the Legend Scale combiners that I talked about so far, this guy is probably my favorite Legend Scale combiner. I really like the materials that New Age uses, and it really helps for this Devastator. Plus he has pretty good articulation and stability for a combiner considering he uses a frame. But considering how great of a Legend Scale combiner this guy is, I gotta put him up at S tier because I think he really is an amazing Legend Scale combiner. But now moving on to our last mini bot, and it's probably the most iconic mini bot, and it's going to be New Age Bumblebee. So just like Cliffjumper, he has an overall decent front, but his legs definitely aren't the greatest. Especially with that knee articulation and those really ugly feet. So just like New Age Cliffjumper, I'm going to be putting this Bumblebee in C tier. But now moving on to a figure that's the exact opposite scale, we're going to have the Pengu Toys Omega Supreme. So you guys might have noticed out of all the Legend Scale figures I have, all of them are going to be different characters. However, I really love Omega Supreme, so I ended up picking up both the Pengu Toys one and the New Age Omega Supreme. And I really like both of these Omega Supremes, and I've actually done a comparison between these two, so if you want to check that out, I'll put a card above. But when it comes to this Omega Supreme, he definitely isn't as good as the New Age Omega Supreme. And as I talked about in my comparison video, it's because this guy's a third of the price of the New Age Omega Supreme. But I think for the price, he is a fantastic figure, so I'm going to be putting this Omega Supreme in B tier. So moving on to the commander of Autobot City, we have New Age Ultra Magnus. So I think this is a pretty solid Ultra Magnus figure, but he definitely does have a lot of problems. And I think a lot of it has to do with him having pieces put onto a white Optimus Prime. The articulation of the White Optimus Prime figure is pretty solid, but once he gets those armor pieces on him, it really limits the articulation. And even though he is a solid Legend Scale Ultra Magnus, I definitely think we could have gotten better. So for New Age Ultra Magnus, I'm going to be putting him at a B tier for now. Now moving on to another Stunticon, we're going to have Magic Square Dead End. Now I really like this figure overall, but I did have some problems with my personal copy. And the main problem I had with him is that I actually had a whole piece break off, so that way I can't even transform him properly anymore. I can still put him in robot mode and vehicle mode, but he just doesn't transform the same. And in my personal opinion, he's just my least favorite Magic Square Stunticon to mess around with. But overall, I still think he is a pretty solid figure, so I'm just going to be putting him at C tier for now. So now moving on to the leader of the Decepticons, we're going to have New Age Megatron. So I really like this Megatron in my Legend Scale collection, and he does look pretty solid, but there are some things I wish were a little better on him. And honestly, the main thing I really don't like about him is how thin he is. I know that's kind of New Age's style to have more of a thinner sculpt for their figures, but I wish Megatron was a bit more beefy like Magic Square's. And besides that, he doesn't have the greatest articulation points, so I'm only going to be putting New Age Megatron at a C tier. But now moving on to our only McFans Toy figure on this list, and it's going to be McFans Toys Blaster. So even though this is just a KO oversize of Magic Square's Blaster, I really do like this figure. However, there are some minor things that I just don't really like about this figure. He's definitely not that bad of a Blaster figure, but if you can get your hands on the original Magic Square version, he's probably much better. Plus, I'll mention that he is a little bit oversized, being more around the size of Ultra Magnus, so just keep that in mind as well. But overall, I think he's a pretty decent Blaster, but I'm only going to be putting him at C tier because I think that the Magic Square one is probably a bit better and probably would be at a B tier. Now moving on to the leader of the Stunticons, we have Magic Square Motor Master. And overall, I think this is a really awesome Motor Master figure. Out of all Magic Square Stunticons, this guy definitely is the best one. I really like his sculpt overall, and I really like his alt mode as well, especially when you have the trailer attached. It just looks fantastic. Plus he has fantastic articulation as well, which you guys know that I absolutely love. So for Magic Square Motor Master, I'm going to be actually putting this guy at an A tier because I think he's a really awesome figure. But now moving on to our last Constructicon, we're going to have New Age Hook. And this guy honestly isn't anything special. He's an alright figure, but I definitely don't think he's greater than some of the other Constructicons we've talked about. And for right now, I think I'm going to be putting this guy probably at a C tier for now. But now going back to talking about the Stunticons, we have Magic Square Drag Strip. And I do think this is a pretty solid drag strip figure. I'll admit the joints on mine are pretty tight, which I'm not a fan of, but overall he's pretty solid. I really like the overall sculpt of this figure, plus I really like the yellows they used on him. It just looks fantastic in person. However, I don't think he's as good as the Wild Rider and Breakdown mold, so I think this guy is going to be going in C tier as well. And speaking of Breakdown, the last figure we have on this list is going to be Magic Square Breakdown. And considering this guy is just a remold of their Wild Rider, he's also going to be going in B tier because it's a pretty solid mold. But now that we ranked all these figures, now I'm going to take a quick second to see if there's any figures that I want to readjust into different tiers. For me, it'll be a few minutes of thinking, but for you guys, it should just be a brief cut.
5 minutes later.
So I think the main thing I do want to adjust is I actually want to move all of the Constructicons that are below A tier up 1 tier. Because they honestly are pretty good figures and I don't think they're all that bad, even Mixmaster with his goofy legs. So we're going to be moving all of the Constructicons up 1 tier. And I think the only other figure that I'm really going to be moving around at all is going to be New Age RC. I think she's actually an A tier. She's a pretty solid figure. And now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more, I think I'm actually going to be moving up the Zeta Superion. I think my rating is a little bit too harsh for him because even though he isn't that great of a combiner, he still is pretty solid. So I'm actually going to move the mini Zeta Superion up to B tier because he's not that bad of a combiner. It's more of the individual bots that are a problem instead of the actual combiner as a whole. Hello everybody, once again Speakerhead from the future here. So I noticed while editing I missed a couple of Legend Scale figures during this list. I think I got all of them now, but I know the main two that I missed are going to be Magic Square Red Alert and McFans Toys or Hot Soldier Soundwave. So because I missed them, I wanted to quickly add them here at the end. So for Magic Square Red Alert, he's a pretty solid figure, so I'm going to be putting him at B tier. And when it comes to the McFans Toys Soundwave, I'll just be honest, this thing is pretty bad. To keep it simple, this thing is just the worst Legend Scale Soundwave you can get, so if you're going to get any sort of Legend Scale Soundwave, go with literally any other option. So the McFans Toys Soundwave is going to be going in F tier with the Zeta Silverbolt. But now I actually have every single Legend Scale figure in my collection ranked. Now once again, back to the present me. But with that last change, I think I'm overall happy with this tier list of all my legend scale figures. I really do think that all these figures that are in S tier are some of the best figures that we have in legend scale. And on the opposite side of things, I think the D and F tier class figures definitely are some of the worst figures that we have in legend scale right now. But that being said, I really do love all the legend scale figures that I own. If I didn't love them, I wouldn't keep them. So even though some of these figures are ranked in C tier, D tier, and even F tier, I really do love all these individual figures. Because when it comes to legend scale figures, yes, the individual figures are fun, but the entire collection as a whole is what really makes it awesome, in my opinion. So even though some of these figures independently aren't the greatest in an overall legend scale collection, some of these figures are fantastic. And I'm personally happy to have every single one of these figures in my collection. But guys, that's going to be my tier list of ranking every single one of my legend scale figures. Let me know what you think down below. Let me know if you agree with this list or if there's any figures you think I should have moved into different tiers. But if you guys enjoyed this content, make sure to like and subscribe. It really does help out the channel. And finally, once again, if you enjoyed any of the music in this video or just want to support the channel in general, it's all part of my royalty-free music label, Speakerhead Studios, link in description. But that's going to be it for me, guys. I appreciate you checking out this tier list, and I'll catch all y'all in the next one. Peace! Big shout out to our channel members. Your guys' support helps keep the channel up and running, so once again, thank you guys for all of your support.